Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Aaron Jones. Aaron is our Director of Congressional Relations at the Wilson Center, but also the creator, producer, and host of the podcast Need to Know, which recently celebrated its 100th episode. He joins us today to talk about that centennial event. Aaron, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, John. Always good to be with you.
So 100 episodes is nothing to sneeze at for any program in any context. I've done this for a long time, and that's quite an accomplishment. So, as I say, congratulations on that. That's really terrific. And I want to quiz you on when was your first episode and who was the first guest?
So my first episode was in May of 2019. Gosh, the world has changed a lot since then. And it's hard to say my first guest. There was the first interview, and then there was the first release. The first interview was with Matt Rajansky, who was the director of the Kennan Institute at the time, and the first release was with Ann Kokas, who was a fellow that we had. She's with the Miller Center down in Virginia, and was talking about is China dictating what we see at the movies. And so those two episodes were sort of released really in tandem, really as one, well, not one episode, but the first two were released together.
And take us back to the origins. Aaron, when did you first get the idea that from the Congressional Relations Office we would produce a podcast?
And that's one of those things that, we were sitting around the office having a team meeting, wondering what other products we could have that would be effective in communicating the Wilson Center's message to an audience, particularly Congress and policymakers. And my associate, Paige Rotunda, at the time, she just said, well, what about a podcast? And I was like, that sounds interesting, because I have all of this experience as an audio engineer. I've done audio stuff for about 2 decades now. And I thought, wow, this is a way that I could actually use the skills that I have on the side and bring them into this professional environment in a way that I hadn't thought of before. So the premise was, if you have an expert has 20 minutes to sit down with a congressional staffer or a policymaker, what do they need to know? And that's where it took off.
Fantastic. And I will let our viewers know that Renaissance man that Aaron is, in addition to those technical skills, he's also a musician. And you composed the theme for Need to Know, is that correct?
I did. I composed the original theme, and then about a year or two later, I upgraded the original theme, and I do the bumper music. That was also kind of fun for me, because if nobody's going to go and buy my music that I produce, then they're really forced to listen to it when I make it the podcast bumper music.
You also save some money by not having to license someone else's music when you do your own original.
And it's branded, right? Because for podcasts there are plenty of royalty-free options out there, but that also means that another podcast might be using the same music, and so it's not really officially yours, and it's not really going with your brand to the tune of your podcast. So that's something I really like about it. It gives it an opportunity to be branded. I've done this for a couple of other podcasts at the Wilson Center as well, to make sure that they have their own music.
So, Aaron, in addition to the music and the technical aspects and the editorial focus and the concept, you weren't a career journalist, so you had to approach this as something new, becoming an interviewer. You've been interviewed, but now you're sitting on the other side of the microphone. Tell us how you approached that. And I will say, as someone who listens to the program, and I know that anyone watching this program who's a regular listener of Need to Know, knows that you've taken to it like a fish to water. There doesn't seem to have been any steep learning curve.
Well, I'm glad I've made it look natural. But when you asked me the question about my first podcast, it made me think of the story of that first episode that I recorded with Matt Rajansky. When I had the idea to do a podcast here, I've got all this equipment. I've got the interfaces and the microphones, and I can make a professional sounding radio quality podcast. And I'm walking down the hallway to Matt Rajansky's office to set up, and I suddenly realize, how do I do an interview? I've never interviewed anyone before. It has been a learning curve. The way that I approach it is I spent 8 years as a congressional staffer, and I have sat on the other side of meetings, which, being the congressional staffer, you have a ton of people come in and try to convince you of their viewpoint, their position, their challenges and problems. And as a staffer, a good staffer is going to ask questions and try to penetrate, just get past the talking points sometimes and try to get to some real answers. And so that's really, I kind of play congressional staffer again, and I try to put myself back in that mode. What would a congressional staffer be asking if this expert was sitting on the couch in their office?
So about that experience and how, I know I've been doing this a long time, and I often think from the perspective of the person on the other side of the camera, right? The viewer, the person sitting at home. What is the follow-up they're begging me to ask? How has your experience as a congressional worker, staffer, informed your approach as an interviewer in that regard? Are you thinking about that all the time? Are you thinking, what would a member of Congress, what would a legislative assistant need to know?
Of course. And really, I think one of the things that we in the think tank community often need to realize is it's about more than just laying out the lay of the land of what is the problem, what's the challenge, but you've got to get to the ask as well. And, a lot of congressional staff, they're well aware of what the problems are. They know the competition with China. They know that Russia invaded Ukraine. But it gets to the next question: what can they do about it? And that's really something that I have to keep top of mind. I can't fall into this, hey, just give me the lay of the land. But okay, well, now what are the policy implications of that? What is a policymaker to do with this information? And so those are usually where I try to follow up. And then another great thing that the Wilson Center really has is the ability to look over the horizon. Sometimes we're overtaken by events, and a lot of times those events are dictated by the media. And the media will often focus on one thing or another, but I have found that our experts are able to get past that. And if there's something that they're seeing that is not trending in the headlines or on Twitter, they're able to point that out. And that's been a really useful portion to what we do. And really the focus of this 100th episode is to celebrate that.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's something that I have really learned to appreciate about the Wilson Center and its expertise in that, the headlines are part of the story for obvious reasons, but the trend lines often reveal even more important information that is often not really contained within the headlines. Let me ask you about, the pronounced partisanship in the city and in the Congress and in American politics right now. And you saw the recent survey of trusted institutions, and Congress leads the list of institutions at all-time lows. And what people see is the partisan bickering over the big polarizing issues. You see Congress on a workaday level. Tell people what they don't really know about what's happening on the Hill that isn't contained in those flashy, divisive headlines.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting question, because something that I get to see is a little bit behind the curtain. And some of the programs that we do at the Wilson Center, the Congressional Relations Office runs a foreign policy fellowship program where we bring Republican and Democratic staffers together and we make them work together, but it's not a hard task. They actually are willing to roll up their sleeves, do tabletop simulations, get to know each other, and we've seen a lot of good fruit from that. Yes, there's always going to be partisanship, and there always has been partisanship. I think what has changed right now is that we have a media structure that really feeds on that, and really you have people who are literally paid to direct anger of constituencies one direction or another. And I think that when congressional staffers really get together, there's an interest in working together, and a lot of times we see that bear fruit with their bosses working together as well.
Mm-hmm. Tell me what kind of feedback you've gotten on Need to Know.
One thing that I hear about Need to Know is that how much they appreciate that they can get an overview, they can get smart on an issue in about 20 or 25 minutes. Mm-hmm. And I pretty well consistently keep the episodes at that amount. The reason why is because if you have a meeting with a staffer, it's unlikely to go longer than a half hour unless you have a really good relationship with that staffer. So you have to be quick. You have to have the elevator pitch and be able to get to the point quickly. But there's also the thought, where are people listening to podcasts the most? A lot of times they're listening on their commute, right? So if you have a congressional staffer or policymaker that may be on the metro for 20 minutes, they know they can get an episode done in 20 minutes. And go into their workday a little bit smarter, being able to give a little bit more advice to their boss with a little bit more of their intellectual capital that the Wilson Center can give them.
So, Aaron, when I do public speaking, there's a question I always get as an interviewer, as a journalist, and that I'm never prepared to answer. And now I get to ask it of you, which is
Sounds fair.
favorite guest, highlight from the 100 episodes, favorite interview?
Well, you'll have to listen to the 100th episode podcast. The idea with the 100th episode is to go back and look at some of the predictions that came true. Over the 3 years that we've done this, 100 episodes, we've had a lot of experts on who have made predictions. One fun one was we had Mike Sfraga on in 2019, and that was really a lay of the land podcast because not many people are knowing what's going on in the Arctic, which is his focus. And I asked the over the horizon question, and he said, we really should be paying attention to Greenland. Greenland is very well strategically placed, and China's interested in it, the United States is interested in it, Europe's interested in it. We really ought to be paying more attention there. And it wasn't but a couple weeks later that President Trump suggested that we buy Greenland. So I got to have Mike Sfraga back on, and we had to talk about that. Really, and it's really, I know that there was a lot of discussion at the time of what's Trump really thinking, but really the notion there was just how strategic Greenland is. Another great episode is Ann Kokas is one of my favorite guests. The insight that she gives on China and their power over the media, both not only within their own country, but the power that they have over media globally. Because in order for a movie that is produced in Hollywood to become a blockbuster worldwide, it has to have the China market, and it has to beat the censors in China. And so you see a lot of bending to the will of the Chinese Communist Party, and Ann Kokas has tracked so much of that. It's really interesting, so we're going to discuss a little bit of that with her. Robert Daly, our China expert, has been with us many times because you can always sound interesting on China, as he says. And Abe Denmark actually had a great piece with us a few years ago telling us to look to really keep an eye on the Pacific Islands, because that's not an area of that much talk within the U.S. policymaking community. But over the years, we've seen as China has tried to get more and more into places like the Solomon Islands and Fiji, trying to create more of a foothold there, we've seen far more policy implications. And so we're going to discuss that as well.
Yeah, that's a great example of some of those trend lines versus headlines. Well, I'm guessing it was very rewarding for you to go back and survey the 100 episodes and put the 100th together.
It certainly was, and I really, it gives me a lot of gratification that the Wilson Center really it gave me a lot of trust. They had a lot of trust in me to just be able to, okay, Aaron, you want to do a podcast? Go ahead. It really has served us well during COVID, as a lot of people have not had the usual channels, especially to reach Congress as we used to. So it's been a great way to get our message out. And I'm very proud to say that we are the most listened to podcast that the Wilson Center has. So that's also very gratifying. And I thank the audience for that and how much they've been interested.
And if people haven't clued in yet, who are watching this program now, tell them how they can find Need to Know, where it is downloaded or downloadable, and how to subscribe.
We're available on all the podcast distribution places, Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, and the rest. A quick way to go and look for Need to Know and all of the other Wilson Center podcasts that are available is to go to wilsoncenter.org/podcasts, and you'll find all of them listed conveniently there in a nice little directory and a way that you can access them for each one.
Well, Aaron, thanks for your ongoing work with Need to Know and all your work at the Center. And thank you for joining us today to help celebrate the 100th episode of Need to Know.
I really appreciate you having me on to do that. Thank you.
A pleasure. Our guest has been Aaron Jones, Wilson Center Director of Congressional Relations and the producer and host of the Need to Know podcast. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for your time and your attention.